So the next business structure we're going to do is that of the company. So the company is a separate legal entity. It's the only business structure we're going to cover that is a separate legal person. Notice what I'm saying there. It's a separate legal person, not a natural person, but at law, it's considered the same as a person. It can own property, it can buy and sell things, etc. And the way it operates is through its employees and its directors, right? They're agents for the company. So it's like the company is the principal to them in many of these relationships. So why don't we get into a little bit more detail around the company structure, because it's the most used form of structure in business today. So a corporation is a artificial legal person. It's separate from its owners. So a company is not its owners. It's able to make contracts, own property, be party to a litigation. So a company is a type of corporation. It's incorporated under the Corporations Act. So the first thing that happens is a company gets created and registered with the regulator. Okay, so a key thing here is you have to write into ASIC and fill in some forms to have the company registered. There has to be at least one member, which is called a share, which you can call a shareholder. For some companies, they're not shareholders though, they're members for not-for-profits. So we call them members in general. A company will have members. It's got to have at least one director. And the director is the person who runs the business. It's possible for the director and the shareholder, or the member, as we know is probably the more correct legal term, it's possible for the director and member to be the same person. Although in larger companies, there's a separation of this ownership and control. So the shareholders in those companies are generally not the people running it. So one of the big differences about a company is it is this separate legal person. So that means it can take on debt, own property, sue and be sued. And really importantly, it gives you this idea of business continuity beyond a person or people. So the business can continue even if the people who own it change or die, etc., or the managers change. And that becomes one of the big advantages. A second big advantage is that the company provides limited liability for the members, for the shareholders. So it means that the owners or the shareholders are not liable for the debts of the company beyond what they pay for in their shares, okay? Beyond what they agree to pay for their shares, they don't have any liability. Their liability is limited. Big advantage of a company structure. Now, within the company structure, there are different kinds of companies. So if you ever see the letters Pty Ltd behind a company name, that means it's a proprietary limited company. Now they tend to be smaller companies, less than 50 shareholders, for instance, okay? If you see the letters Ltd, that will be a public company, okay? They tend to be larger companies. This kind of company can raise money from the public under certain conditions, okay? So I won't go into the detail of that, but you have a lot more access to raising capital in this kind of company than in this kind of company. However, this kind of company, this proprietary limited company, Pty Ltd, they have kind of fewer regulatory requirements. And this is the kind of company that you set up if you set up a family business, a family company. You'll set up this kind of company. When you're going to the public, when you maybe want to list on a securities exchange, etc., you'll be a public company when you need lots of money in order to be able to carry on the business. Now, within proprietary companies, there's small companies and large companies, and that's determined by a 2 out of 3 test. The size of the company in terms of its assets, the size of the company in terms of its employees, and the size of the company in terms of its turnover. Okay. Within a public company, there's 2 kinds of companies. An unlisted public company, which is not on any of the stock exchanges or securities exchanges, and a listed public company. So these ones are the ones that you hear about on the news, like BHP and NAB. And when they're talking about listed companies, these are the ones. Now, in Australia, there's well over 1 million companies in total, but there's only about a little bit over 2,500 kind of listed companies. So there's actually very few of these kind of companies compared to how many other kinds of companies there are, most of which are these proprietary companies. So let's go over some details. A Pty Ltd is a privately owned company with less than 50 shareholders, and it's prohibited from selling shares to the public. It uses the Pty Ltd, and you only need to have one director. It's possible for the single director and single shareholder to be the same person. A company that's not a proprietary is a public company in general. There's a couple of little exceptions to that, but in general. Public companies can, but don't have to be, listed on a securities exchange. They usually have the abbreviation LTD. They must hold an AGM, an annual general meeting, every year, and they must have at least 3 directors. So what you can see is because they're open to the public more, there's greater governance requirements on them. Why would you have a company? Let's just reiterate: separate legal entity, limited liability, perpetual succession so you can sell the business, etc. More sources of capital. You can get expert managers. Shares can be transferred and can even be liquid, especially in a public company. However, it costs a lot to establish, and there's lots of ongoing fees in running a company. You can lose lots of your rights as an owner because, remember, the directors are the ones who are now running it day to day. So unless you're both a director and an owner, you give up these rights. There can be lots of administrative requirements under certain laws once you have a company. You have to report things and disclose things to the government, to the regulators like ASIC, and you have legal responsibilities if you do become a director. But overall, generally, most businesses find that these advantages of the separate legal entity and limited liability outweigh these disadvantages, and they will choose a company form.